Hey, folks, this is Mark Devine with the Unbeatable Mind podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today. Super stoked to have you here. We're going to have an incredible conversation with my friend, Cal Newport. Before I get into introducing Cal a little bit more in detail, uh, please rate this podcast if you could take a few moments. It really helps us podcasters if you could go to iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast and rate it. I recommend you just start on the right star and just click that one because that'll save you time. You don't have to think too much about it. And of course, that means I get a 5-star review, which would be awesome. We have over 1,000 of those. Like I said, it just helps us stay kind of easy to find, and it helps your friends find it. And also referring it to other people is awesome. And the reason it's awesome is because I have guests like Cal. Now, Cal's been a friend for a few years. I interviewed him early on with about his book Deep Work, which had a profound influence on the way I organize my life for my own writing, which is kind of the way I do my deep work, or what I use deep work for primarily. And he's just kind of he's at the forefront of thinking about culture and what the impact of, digital media and tools like email and social media and everything, and the impact it has had on our productivity, on our ability to concentrate, and our ability to get important shit done. And I think I'm excited to listen, to talk to Cal about his newest book, which is A World Without Email. Can you imagine that? A world without email, where he says is a place where you spend most of your day actually working on hard things instead of talking about that work or endlessly bouncing small tasks back and forth in messages. Cal, it's good to see you again. Thanks for joining me today, buddy.
Of course, it's always a pleasure, Mark.
Yeah. So, you're a professor. You mentioned that you're on leave, but you're a professor of computer science. How did someone like you get interested in this whole strand of thinking about minimalism and decluttering and deep work? Where did that come from?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. One way is these books have a lot to do with technology
Hmm.
and their unexpected impacts. And I'm a computer science professor, so I'm a professional technologist. So it does make sense for someone in my position, an academic technologist, to do some theorizing
Hmm.
about the impacts of these tech on culture. The real story is actually more haphazard. I've been writing books since I was a college student, and I wrote Deep Work. That was my first book that had some overlap with the world of technology. And the reception of that book and what I learned after that book came out really threw me down this path of really trying to understand, in particular, the way these new tools, the way they help us, but also the way they have these unintended side effects.
Hmm. You say that pretty much about any technology, right? I mean, look at nuclear technology and AI. I mean, any technology has probably equal positive and equal negative. I don't think anyone really appreciated the negative impact of some of the technologies that you've really investigated, such as email and social media. Now, social media, of course, people are starting to understand that, especially after this last year and the election and all that kind of stuff. But with email, most people would say it's a pretty positive thing. It seems to me that we can get a lot more done in a lot less time with email. So, what do you say about that? Like, does all technology have a positive and a negative side, or just some, right? Or what's your take on this?
I like the phraseology that the late social critic Neil Postman used. He talked about new technologies have ecological impacts. So you don't end up, after a new technology comes along, being in your own world plus having that new technology there. It actually changes the whole ecology, just like coming in and introducing a new species
Hmm.
to a wetlands or something like this might really change drastically the way that whole ecology operates. Now, some tech does this at a small scale and some does this at a large scale. Some have overwhelming negative effects, some have overwhelming positive effects. But the key is that they can have these effects and
Hmm.
we're often not ready for them. And one of my
Hmm.
big arguments is that we don't actually pay enough attention. We're too quick to let tech come in. We be exuberant about it.
Hmm.
We focus on what we like about it. And then we just accept the side effects. Or I think we need to be more critical. And email is a great example. I document its spread in the book. And you can
Hmm.
see email spread happens mainly in the first half of the 1990s. So you have email spread very rapidly throughout offices because It solved several pragmatic problems very well. It replaced the fax machine, the voicemail, and the inner office memo. It was clearly a better technology for all three of those
Hmm.
different modes of asynchronous communication. But as Postman said, there's ecological effects. So after email was present, after everyone got access to low friction digital communication, it also brought with it another side effect, sort of like DDT working on
Hmm.
the thickness of eagle shells, and suddenly we find birds of prey dropping out of these wetlands. It had the side effect of just the presence of these new tools also changed the way we collaborated. And suddenly we said, you know what? It would just be easier if we just sort of figured things out on the fly
Hmm.
with back and forth messages, just like we would figure something out if we were in the same room. Let's just everyone figure things out on the fly with back and forth messages because now that's possible.
Well,
And it
hold on right there.
drastically changed the way we collaborated.
Well, what you're right, totally agree with that. And now I'm trying to remember back in my mind how we initially used email. It wasn't on this on the fly problem solving, do this, do that, because we didn't have mobile phones for one. You had to be sitting at your computer. But also the way way we were taught to think and write was much more long form and, stating an issue. You know what I mean? I don't think we had it was different. So what did your research show you how it was different when it was working better versus now?
Well, I mean, originally it was a replacement for things we were already doing. A little known story. I don't even know if this is in the book, but I just was spending a lot of time looking at the history of email. One of the big things that helped that technology accelerate, it was a collection, a lobbying agency on behalf of a lot of large aerospace industry
Hmm.
companies lobbied to have this standard introduced, this networking standard introduced, so that they could send information back and forth. Different companies that were part of the same, they're collaborating because there would be a military contract spread over, let's say, three or four different companies. And they basically got AT&T to introduce this now little known protocol standard
Hmm.
that meant this aerospace defense company could then essentially fax that aerospace company, but without having to use a fax machine. You could actually
Good.
send these messages electronically.
Interesting.
Once this standard was enforced, companies could talk to each other. We
Hmm.
had a common framework for how we could send emails back and forth to each other. And so this was one of the initial things that got it going. It's like, this is great. A fax machine's a pain. You got to feed paper through this machine and use a phone line. Email is great. And within the office, people used it as an alternative to voice messages because you wanted the asynchrony of, I want to leave you this message when I'm ready, and you can listen to or read it when you're ready. It was seen as a productivity silver bullet. And so to the extent that it was just replacing long established and polished communication behaviors, it was great.
Hmm.
But it also brought in this other behavior of, now that it's here, let's just rock and roll. And I just really want to emphasize that this way of collaborating, I call it the hyperactive hive mind,
Mm.
is something that followed email. We did not used to work that way, and it's largely unintentional. It's one of these ecological changes. No one ever said it was a good idea. It was just our emergent response to having these tools available.
Could you point to any particular reason why that happened? Why that, the evolution to this this, hive bind of email use happened?
It's a fascinating question because no one had really looked at it. So I uncovered a few different threads that I think are relevant. Probably one of the biggest threads is that in knowledge work, unlike other sectors, we have this real obsession with autonomy.
Hmm.
And I trace this back to Peter Drucker, the management theorist Peter Drucker, who coined the term knowledge work in the 1950s, really
Right.
helped American industry in particular understand what knowledge work was. And he had this message: autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. You have to leave the knowledge worker to figure out on their own how they get things done. And this autonomy message really stuck. That's where we got management by objectives from. It came from
Hmm.
Peter Drucker. But because of that message, we have a mindset in knowledge work of, it's not up to me to tell you how to organize your work. Productivity is personal. Go buy a David Allen or Cal Newport book if you're feeling disorganized, right? It's not up to us. Well, when you leave it all up to the individuals, you're much more likely to stay stuck on a lowest common denominator mode of collaboration, something that's going to be easy and convenient and fast. In the hyperactive hive mind, it was that. It's very easy. It's very flexible. It's very convenient. If you're in charge of your own organization, it's kind of the thing you're going to fall back into. And it also matches our natural instinct for how, in our deep history, how we would normally interact. I mean,
Hmm.
if we were just together on the savannah, hunting a tiger, It would just be back and forth unscheduled. Let's go. Let's just figure it out. You go over there, I'll come over here. So it's very
Mhm.
natural.
Mhm.
And so I think we're stuck there because we're not used to thinking more systemically
Mhm.
about, well, how do we actually want to collaborate? We just say, look, that's not up to me. I just give you objectives.
That's fascinating. Now, there are definitely different personalities who use email differently. You've got people like me who are zero inbox. I like to kind of leave whatever is an important email in there until it's done, and it's kind of like checking off a task. And then there's other people who let thousands of emails build up in their inbox, and they just kind of scroll through and see what they want to respond to. Is there any? Let's just assume we don't get rid of email or find a new process. Is there any best practices around email besides just getting rid of it, or not doing it except for once a day or something like that?
Well, my big focus is we can't solve it in the inbox. We can't solve this problem in the inbox. I think that's why we're all frustrated is that we've tried to solve the problem
That's a
of
really
this
good point. I
hyperactive
have
hive
done that.
mind.
Right. Try
Yeah,
to
so
solve it from
so we're
within the
we're
paradigm that created it.
that's all that we have mainly tried is like let's have better etiquette, let's have better norms, let's have better hacks, let's turn off notifications, let's have email free Fridays. My big argument is that it's the underlying workflow, this hyperactive hive mind workflow that's generating all that pressure in the inbox. Because what's
Hmm.
happening here is if informal back and forth messaging is the main way you work things out, you now have a couple dozen of these digital ping pong tables arrayed in front of you. And every time a ball comes back across the net, you got to knock it back again. So you can't be that far away from your inbox or Slack channel or WhatsApp or whatever tool you use. You can't be that far away from it because you have to service these unscheduled ongoing conversations. I think we get frustrated when we try to solve this problem by saying, oh, I'll check my inbox less because those ping pong balls are coming back.
Hmm.
And if you don't check your inbox, they're going to fall off the table. It's going to be a problem. It's
Hmm.
why we can't solve this problem with just those type of habits. And so the big mindset shift I've been trying to pitch is you have to go underneath the inbox,
Hmm.
go process by process. Okay, here's something I do repeatedly. We answer client questions. Here's something else I do repeatedly. We put out a podcast episode each week. And for each, say, how do we want to do this as not the hyperactive hive mind? How do we actually want to collaborate and get this done that requires many fewer unscheduled back and forth messages? You do this process by process, you take the pressure out of the inbox. And then it doesn't really matter, what your habits are around the inbox that much, or if you have notifications or what apps you use, or if you have AI just auto filling in things so you can
Hmm.
type faster. None of that really matters anymore if you don't have so many ongoing conversations you have to service.
Isn't it partially true that even if we did that, the inbox would just get filled up with other things? Isn't that the nature of kind of the way our life works? We say, okay, we're gonna find a better way to do that. That opens up some space, and then suddenly something else fills that space.
It might, but I profile teams and companies that when they start moving away from the hive mind to things that are more structured, it just goes well.
Interesting.
A good example of this, I think a classical example is computer programmers.
Hmm.
So they're in the knowledge sector, but for reasons unrelated to this, having to do with the demands of project management. They long ago, for the most part, got rid of the hyperactive hive mind. They don't really just work things out on Slack or email. They instead have these agile methodologies like Scrum or Kanban, where it's really clear about who's working on what. They have very clear ways they coordinate with these very structured daily stand up meetings. Okay, what are you working on? What do you need? Here's the one thing you should be doing. Go do that. We'll leave you alone. And it's been a huge boon for productivity in the software development space. So when you move away from just let's rock and roll on the
Hmm.
inbox
Hmm.
and let's get a little bit more specific about how we collaborate, it really opens up a lot of cognitive space. I mean, it makes people
Yeah.
happier. You can think clearer.
Hmm.
You're not constantly servicing these channels. It's these alternatives are almost always much better.
Yeah, it makes sense. I would like to talk in a moment about how some people are succeeding in this, with this theory or this practice. But what are the risks of not doing this? Like, what's happening in our culture as a result of this hive email mentality? What are the downsides?
Well, the main cost here is context shifting, right? So the villain in this book is the neurological price of changing your attention from one target to another.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complicated process. It's a neurochemically involved process and it takes time. And so what happens is if we are servicing an inbox, let's say we're checking an inbox once every 6 minutes. So we have to, all these ping pong balls are coming back and forth. We have to keep hitting them. Every time we look at the inbox, we're going to initiate one of these context shifts, right? So it's a neurological change that's going to take a while. That begins happening. We're inhibiting some neural networks, we're amplifying some others, but then we wrench our attention back to the main thing we're doing. So we put the brakes on that shift and try to switch back to where we were. Everything piles up. It's a cognitive catastrophe. We can't think clearly and it exhausts us. So if you make a living using your brain, there's fewer things you can do that's going to make it harder to do the work you need to do than to keep having to check other things every few minutes that are going to drastically change your context and then drastically change it back again. So we've made it almost impossible to actually do the work that we're coordinating using these tools.
Yeah, and this extends to checking social media. I assume that's really no different than going, because a lot of people will respond, to their social media posts, every ding that they get.
Yeah, well, social media is killing us too for exactly the same reason, these context shifts. What's interesting is the comparison between social media and email. They look the same in the sense that they cause the same problem. It induces a lot of context shifting, makes it really hard to actually do your work. It can make you unhappy. It can stress you out. They differ, however, in terms of the cause and the solution, right? So why do we check social media so much? Well, it's been engineered to induce that behavior that makes money for people. And the solution is check it less. Email's more complicated. The reason why we check email so much is because the fundamental way we collaborate in our organizations is through unscheduled back and forth messaging. So we can't solve the problem as easy as we do the social media problem, which is, take that phone while you're working and just throw it as far as you can. You can't do that with email. You actually have to change the way you collaborate. Otherwise, you have no recourse but to go back to the channel. So they feel like very similar problems.
Right.
But the solution for the email problem is it's more subtle for sure.
Yeah, one is, you don't want to miss it because you get that dopamine hit from responding or seeing what people are saying, good or bad. And the other is you have this anxiety that you're missing something important and you're going to be out of the workflow, or, you'll stop the workflow by missing the email. That's fascinating. The other thing about this is, it's the brain's tendency to veer toward negative for any communication that isn't like over the top positive. I think we talked about that with, I think it was you and I, but maybe with someone else, where we're generally like with email communication. And I've noticed this, if something comes in that's super positive, we'll probably read it and receive it as neutral. If something comes in as neutral, we receive it as negative. And if something comes in as negative, like you screwed up, it's a freaking 3 alarm fire. It's total disaster, right? And
Yeah.
so we have the brain's tendency with, with the way we work, or brain processes to veer toward negative. And so incessant email use and incessant social media makes us more negative as individuals and as a culture. Did you touch on that at all or see that in your research?
I do. I got into some of the research about the impoverished nature of linguistic only communication. So
Hmm.
just the written word
Hmm.
is a very impoverished form of communication. We're very bad at it.
Right.
There's these nice studies I cite where you basically assess the person about to send an email, how confident they are,
Hmm.
that what they're about to send is going to be understood. The emotional valence of it's going to be understood. And they vastly overestimate how well it's going to be understood on the other end, because when you strip away facial cues, when you strip away tone of voice, when you strip away pacing of back and forth, you're losing a lot of information. Now, people will say, yeah, but letter writing has this deep history of all these famous thinkers in history would
Hmm.
all they had to communicate with each other was letters back and forth. But if you ever go back and read letters from the great age of letters,
Oh, yeah.
they're really complicated. They're pages long. Why is this? Because it's incredibly difficult to try to set the proper emotional context. It takes paragraphs of careful language and flourishes to try to
Hmm.
set the
Hmm.
right emotional tone so people understand what you're trying to say to them. In the hyperactive hive mind, we're just shooting off emails really quick,
Hmm.
hoping that 4 exclamation points and some emojis can fill in for, this deeply evolved ability to read each other's facial cues. And so people get misunderstood, and then people get upset, or they think there's an issue. And so, yeah, we cause a lot of unnecessary misery by trying to force human interaction into just entirely text-based medium,
Right.
which was another real shortcoming, I think, of this way of collaboration.
That's fascinating. It reminds me, I think it was Mark Twain who said that I wrote this book. Sorry, I wrote this book because I really didn't have time to write a paragraph.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's hard.
I didn't have time to write you a shorter letter type thing. It is
Yeah,
hard.
yeah,
Yeah. And it was a skill. I mean, you would never, I read a lot of these letters. I look at a lot of colonial history. You look at the letters that, John Adams would send to his wife, or that George Washington would write to one of
right.
the other generals. And to our ear, it's like, wow, this seems kind of over the top. There's so much this and that and this. But they understood back then because it was their only means of
Yeah,
communication at distance. It's really hard to make it clear that I'm a little worried that you did this. I'm not mad at you, but also like I'm here.
right,
Like it's complicated. And they would
right.
spend paragraphs of text trying to set it. And now we just throw an exclamation point on every sentence and say, maybe that'll work. I mean, we should just put a disclaimer on every email just that says,
Right.
I'm not mad at you. Because I think you're right.
That's a great idea.
That's the initial instinct is like, what? Why is
Right.
Mark so mad at me? Screw you, Mark.
Yeah. Or
Come
someone who
on.
just happens to
Yeah.
have their cap locks on. It's like, why are you shouting at me? Stop it.
Why are you shouting at me? What'd I do?
What are the health risks, that we're dealing with here from this hive mind kind of overload of email and social media?
Well, it makes us unhappy. I mean, for sure.
Hmm.
I have a chapter called Email Makes Us Miserable, where I pulled together a lot of the research and explanations for it. But it's a real mismatch. It's a real mismatch for how humans are wired to interact. It's going to make us unhappy. We have the mismatch of linguistic versus non linguistic that we just talked about. The other thing that seems to really get to people is the idea that there's an inbox that's filling in the background, and it's filling with messages from people who need something from you. That presses deep buttons for us, right? We
Hmm.
take social interaction very seriously. Our Paleolithic history is a tribal history. That's one in which you need to have very careful one on one relationships maintained with your other tribe members, because otherwise, when there's a famine, they won't share their food and you're going to die. We take it very seriously. There's experiments I cite in the book that say, even if your rational mind, your more, your frontal cortex is saying it's okay, these emails are not critical, we have norms, I know what they are, they're not urgent, it doesn't matter, that deeper social network isn't convinced, and it's really stressed out, and it's people need me and I'm not responding to them. We underestimate the degree to which that really makes us as social human beings, it really makes us unhappy.
That's fascinating. So let's talk about at an organizational level, how have some of the organizations you research, dealt with this so that they move beyond the hive mentality?
It's all about the workflow, right? We have to ignore the inbox for now and say there's various processes that make up what we do. There's various ways to implement each of these processes. If we haven't talked about it already, we're probably just using the hive mind because that's the default. What do we want to do instead? And the right metric to think about there is reducing these unscheduled back and forth messages. So
Hmm.
how can we get this thing that we do repeatedly done without just having to have a bunch of unscheduled back and forth messages? And then you have a huge toolkit
Hmm.
depending on what we're talking about. But like, let's say there's a you produce a podcast and there's steps that have to happen every time they get the episode out. That's a low hanging fruit example where, okay, we can automate these steps in such a way that it's not just sending an email like, okay, Mark, take a look at this, and you send an email back and like, hey, Jeff, like go through and edit this, and what about this? Like, okay, we can automate that. It goes into this Dropbox by this time. There's a spreadsheet where we keep track of all the episodes. We change the cell
Hmm.
to the next thing when we're ready for the next status. When I see that, I grab it, whatever, right? There's a process there that doesn't just involve back and forth or client questions. We might say, well, right now that we just let clients, they have the email address of some of us, they just email us when they need us. Uh, is there a way we could resolve client questions without unscheduled messages? They're like, okay, what we're going to do instead is whatever. We have a weekly call after which they get a written summary of everything we committed to, or we have a client portal where they can sign up. We have a Calendly like link in there, white labeled, where they can go in and sign up to get a call within 24 hours with someone on the team, whatever. But you're going process by process and saying, how do we implement this without just needing unscheduled back and forth messages? And so the companies that have succeeded have just gone process by process and said, we don't want unscheduled messaging if at all possible. You do this enough times, and people's inboxes go from this chatter that you have to constantly check into something like a physical mailbox. Oh, yeah, check it once a day because I'm waiting for this file that might be useful, or I'm getting an invoice from my accountant or something like that. It's a completely different way of thinking about work.
Do they find that once these processes are set up, that there's some retraining, like cognitive retraining that needs to happen for employees who are just kind of conditioned to constantly check their email every 10 minutes or so?
It can be hard. I talked about this small company in Germany, and they went to was a 5 hour a day workday. They would end their workday around 1 or 2, and they
Wow.
wanted it to really be the end of the workday. And so they realized the way this was going to happen is they, among other things, they had to tame the hive mind, right? So they were like, we're going to come in and have more specific processes for how we collaborate, so we're not in email all day, and so that we're not in meetings all day. They actually, the CEO was telling me they had to hire a coach at some point to actually work with employees and like really retrain them because it was so built in. So
Mhm.
it's not necessarily an easy lift. I mean, I recommend doing it first just for yourself. It's the
Mhm.
easiest way to get started. Just look at all the processes in your life and say, given just what I can control, how can I implement this in such a way that reduces the back and forth messaging? Once people are used to that, probably teams are the right granularity, right? Here's a team within a company. Let's agree together on what our new processes are going to be, and let's check in on a regular basis, and let's have escape valves if something goes wrong and make sure everyone has a say. That's probably the right way to do it. My fear is if you try to hand these down from the top down in a large enough organization, you're just going to get stagnated in bureaucracy, which is
Right.
just as bad, right?
Right.
So if you
Mhm.
have 1,000 person company and the COO is just going to tell everyone, here's how we do everything, that's not going to work either. So I think start with the individual to get the mindset going,
Mhm.
get some practice, and then each team can work out internally. Here's our processes. And then they can also, for external facing communication with other teams, here's our protocols for incoming information to us, right? So that can be facilitated at the organizational level. But once you get past the individual to the team level, it's not a super easy lift. But there is massive productivity on the table here. I mean, massive, right? In terms of what you could produce and reducing turnover and happiness and sustainability of the role. So it's one of these things where it's absolutely worth it going through
Mhm.
that pain.
It makes sense. And the term massive begs a statistic, but it's probably too early, right, for any research on this, is it?
I mean, the statistic I like to cite is from the industrial sector, right? So Peter Drucker, again, if we return talk about Peter Drucker, um, he looked at the industrial sector in the 20th century and said they got serious. They got serious about asking, how do we actually do things? And
Mhm.
is there a better way to do it? They got serious about that in the early 20th century in particular. And he said, because of that focus from 1900 to 1999, that sector grew 50 times, which is an astronomical number. It was such a generation of wealth that he basically says all of the developed economies of the world were built on the back of the wealth generated by that 50x increase in industrial productivity. So, astronomically large increase in productivity. In 1999, Drucker said knowledge work right now is where industrial work was in 1900. Like, we haven't even really started asking the question of what's the best way to do this.
Mm.
And so, if there's anything like a 50x growth lurking, then all of our attention should be here. That's such a large, that compounds so much over the years. It's such a sort of world changing number that it's really hard to ignore, which, by the way, is why it is increasingly not being ignored. I mean, I hear from more C-suite types, I hear from investors more. They're starting to realize there's hundreds of billions of dollars of GDP on the table right here
Mhm.
because we're so ineffective about how we do knowledge work, because we're so stuck with this hive mind type mentality. People are noticing that's
Mhm.
too much possible growth to ignore. So this is why I'm very optimistic that this
Mhm.
world without email I'm talking about, it's inevitable for sure. It's only a matter of whether or not you are out in front of it or you're trailing behind when these transformations happen.
Is there any emergent tech or tool that can kind of capture the essence of what your vision is for, you know, still not getting rid of email entirely, but using it for in the right way at the right times, while there's some workflow processes that, you know, that you can plug and play or that are easy to implement for the rest of the stuff or to get most of the stuff done?
I mean, so there's no killer app because each different process has its own demands. And some
Yeah.
of these implementations that reduce back and forth are entirely analog. Like,
Hmm.
we have this weekly meeting, we figure it all out, or we have a mailbox where put the forms to sign in this box and I sign them on Fridays and you pick them up. Like some of it's just completely analog. Some of it has to do with communication protocols. So communication tools can be useful. Some of it has to do with project management tools. Something that came up a lot in the book, for example, to give one concrete example, was task boards. So shared task boards make a lot of appearances in these groups moving past the hyperactive hive mind, where
Mm-hmm.
who's working on what, its status, and all the related
Mm-hmm.
information is on a board we all see. It's not an email spread out among our inboxes. It's Trello or Flow or in Basecamp, depending on the tool. Specific tool might not matter, but
Mm-hmm.
here's a shared board for each project we're working on. Here's everything that's going on in the project and its status and the information, who's working on what, and you put it in different columns based on its status. And we have some way of coming in very quickly and saying, okay, you're doing this now. Let me assign it to you. What do you need from me? Those are an example of something that shows up a lot, right? When people start to think a little bit more critically, how do we want to keep track of who's working on what and assign it and check in and move information? These task boards are a way to do that that's
Mm-hmm.
much, much more effective from a cognitive usage standpoint than just what all of us can just send messages back and forth to all of us as we need things. It's
Mm-hmm.
much superior to that.
Interesting. Well, some of the, I guess I'll put for some or have some of the executives that you've talked to gotten rid of email entirely and allowed a staff member to kind of manage their inbox for them? And if so, what worked for them?
Yeah.
How did that work? Because I've
Yeah.
I've toyed
So
with that myself. I've had this fantasy of, having my assistant do it, but every time I've tried to go there, it actually creates more work for me. So I guess I'm not a good process setup kind of guy. I need a little support there.
well, it's a good example of the underlying dynamic. So to get out of your own inbox, if what you try to do is just, here's my inbox, I do a lot of stuff through the hive mind,
Right.
let me give it to someone else, right? Say, hey, you handle this. It doesn't work well because they say, well, look, I can't hit all these ping pong balls back over the net for you. You're in the middle of these informal collaborations and decisions and communications with all these people. Me as your assistant, I don't know what to tell them, right? Where people can get really away from their inbox is where they couple that commitment with, well, let me figure out the different types of interactions or processes I'm involved with and put something else in place.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is how I deal with this. This is how I deal with that. This is how I deal with this. And then you're in a situation where you don't really need that inbox. You don't really have to interact with an inbox. And maybe an assistant can then either take care of what remains, or because things are really clearly defined how things work, they're much more able to be a part of those interactions on your behalf. But I think the failure of people to just simply say, you handle my inbox,
Mm-hmm.
underscores the degree to which we're using these inboxes as just this like informal, let's figure everything out on the fly. So it's a good inducement towards, we got to figure out better ways of doing this collaboration, because until we do, you can't outsource that. You can't hand that off to someone else because they can't be you. But the
Mm-hmm.
irony, of course, is once you optimize these processes, so less back and forth unscheduled messaging, your need to have someone else be between you and the inbox really reduces because the pressure on that inbox really reduces.
Right.
So
Interesting.
it's one of these interesting things where technology can actually play the role of an assistant for you if you couple it with real serious thinking about how do we actually want to do all these different things that happen frequently in our organization.
Right. I'm sure some listeners are thinking what I'm thinking right now is that sounds great, Cal. Has anyone figured out how to turn this into a consulting practice or coaching business so that I can get some help?
I'm sure they will.
Me too. It's a
So
huge opportunity.
yeah,
I might do it myself.
it's, well, I mean, the money on the table is so huge because of what's on the line here in terms of when you do this swapping. So it's an interesting question. The place where I think this will change, and maybe my book will help change this, that we'll have more of this process reengineering mindset, the knowledge work in general. To
Mm-hmm.
me, that's the biggest jump we have to get over. We have to get over this autonomy notion, this notion of like it's up to the individual. We got to think about process reengineering. I think there'll be a big consulting world there. The one niche in here where there is already a pretty thriving consulting industry is for automation. So
Mm-hmm.
of all the different processes that you could handle with back and forth messages and replace with something better, one type of process are those that can be automated, right? In the sense of it's always the same steps in the same order.
Hmm.
This information goes here, this person does that, then it goes to this person. There's been a lot of interesting work with tools like Airtable, for
Hmm.
example, coupled with something like Zapier, which
Hmm.
hooks Airtable into various applications you might have on your computer. There's a pretty thriving consultant scene out there for people to come in and automate the things that can be automated. Like the whole process of I was just talking to someone recently, a podcaster that has completely automated the whole pipeline of asking someone to be on the show, getting their information, making sure they have the information, getting all the information for the show, doing the recording getting to the editor with the right stuff. Like the whole thing has been bound together with this software glue. So the whole thing requires very little interaction from them. So
Hmm.
that's just
Interesting.
one of many ways you can start to move past these back and forth. But that's one way where there's a lot of interesting thinking.
Hmm.
I think it's going to be a huge industry. Honestly,
Hmm.
I think management consulting became a huge industry in the second half of the 20th century in particular. I think in this first half of the 21st century, this sort of knowledge work process reengineering is going to be massive because you're going to come into a company, get processes that stick, and everyone's going to be 3x more productive and your turnover is going to drop. I mean, that's a huge ROI. And I think it's inevitable that you're going to see that being a much bigger industry.
It's fascinating. One of my friends I'm doing a podcast with next Friday is the CEO of EY. This is going to be I'm going to ask them about this. Like, what are they thinking and how are they approaching this? Because I'm sure that they're involved in some way. You would think, right? These global consultancies are probably being asked to figure this out somehow.
Yeah,
And
except for the consultants themselves are famously hive minded. So
right, I know.
that's
That's maybe they need
I
to
talk
start with
about in the book.
themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say let me see your inbox first before before I hire you to help us with our hive mind problem.
The people who are running these organizations, and even you and I, are educated, middle-aged professionals, and many of us didn't grow up with email in our youth, right? And so our minds were kind of already structured and okay with more analog work. But what about our youth, right? Those born after 2008, after Steve Jobs landed the iPhone on us. How do we, how are we going to work with the next wave of professionals who are coming into the workforce who are just like glued and also are looking forward to having it implanted in their head?
It's an issue for sure. I think their brains have become very used to a very fragmented type of
Right.
attention existence. So
It's
jump
just
to this, jump
fast.
to that, jump to this, jump to that, which is, as we talked about before, exactly the opposite of how you want to design a cognitive landscape if you want to actually try to add value to information using your brain. We can't do that context shifting. And I think the young generation has told themselves this story that we've adapted to that.
Right.
Like, yeah, we were Mark and Cal, they don't know about this. They didn't grow up with it, but we did. We've adapted to it. But you can't in 20 years change 200,000 years worth of neural wiring, right? We have not actually evolved to be able to very quickly context shift or have two parallel tracks of attention going. We still can't do that. So what we really have is just a generation that is suppressing their cognitive capabilities. And
Hmm.
that itself probably has an economic hit because it's not just they're very comfortable with Slack and email and going back and forth, but obviously they're doing this more on their own with their phones. They're doing this more on their own with social media, et cetera. And of all the debates we have about things like social media, being online, et cetera, the piece of the debate we probably don't have enough is the economic impact of taking an economy that's becoming increasingly knowledge based, right? So it's up to 50% of our economy and growing now. It's a sector of our economy that depends on just brains producing value. And we are getting more and more addicted to behavior, connected to behavior that makes us worse and worse at that, right? And
Hmm.
and so we may have talked about the Sparta analogy in a previous conversation, but it would be like if you're in ancient Sparta where warfare was your business. Like this is what our city state does. We need to be good at it. It's how we survive. If you saw people were getting into a habit of eating terribly and whatever the ancient Greek equivalent of smoking is, and it was putting them into terrible shape and making them very bad at fighting, we'd say this is terrible. Like we have to
Right.
build our whole society to be in good shape and brave. That's what's really happening right now. We're rebuilding our society to be built around our brains and our ability to concentrate while having a culture concurrent to that in which we get really bad at using our brains and really bad at concentrating.
Yeah.
So I think it's more of an issue than people think. We look at the more
Agreed.
proximate issues with these problems, like, well, what are people saying on social media, and who is on there, and are the wrong ideas spreading? But there's this step back and say, well, what's the impact on a cognitive culture when we spend all of our time doing this back and forth attention switching, which really has a negative effect on our brains?
That's fascinating. We touched on this earlier on in the show, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is as a race or as humans, we don't really have a vision, a collective vision or kind of plan for the future. It's not how things work. We just kind of technology comes, like you said, we just grab onto it and run with it, irrespective of what potential negative outcomes there could be. And we don't have a mechanism to like pause and slow down and think, is this really a good idea? I remember reading recently, about the Manhattan Project and how some of the researchers in the project were started to get really cold feet, and they started saying, slow down, let's ask these questions, let's ask better questions. But by then the cat was out of the bag. The train was in motion.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And I agree. Part of the issue here, and part of the solution we can get from this diagnosis is if we flip things around and say, okay, I'm very intentional about my life. I'm very intentional about the way I run my businesses. I know what I'm about. I know what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to avoid. And from that mindset, you then turn around and look at the landscape of new tools and
Hmm.
innovations. That works pretty well. You're like, okay, so I know what I'm all about. So let me pull this tool over here because it helps me do that. I know my company's really interested in this. If we use this in this way, that seems to really help. Where we get into trouble with the new innovations is where we just let them wander into our lives arbitrarily. Like, this seems interesting. I don't know. Everyone's on Clubhouse. I guess I should be on Clubhouse. Email. I don't like my fax machine. Yeah, let's just start using email. When we don't actually think about how we're deploying these tools and why, we keep having these ecological shifts. And one of
Hmm.
the interesting things is there's a whole field of study called the philosophy of technology.
Hmm.
All throughout the 20th century, we had a lot of big think type books and articles from people who were thinking about what was called technological determinism, but basically the way in which you introduce a tool for reason X and then it creates this whole other change that no one expected. Right. And a lot of people were thinking this through. And it was really interesting. And then there's like this famous book from the 50s, for example. It was called the Structure of Social Change in Medieval
Hmm.
Europe, where they basically, it's this very careful scholarship that traced back the introduction of the horse stirrup to medieval Europe created feudalism. But and they,
Right.
they connected the whole thing. They brought it in because it came from the steppes. It was like an easier way to ride horses, but it allowed knights to brace themselves when they were doing a lance attack. And it was like this whole
Interesting.
shock warfare. And you had feudalism had to arise as a way to, how do we actually support an armored cavalry, because it requires a huge amount of land. And the only
Hmm.
way we're going to have to do this is if we break up the land. And so we have to get the land from the churches and give it to nobles so that they can support a certain blah, blah, blah. It's a whole book about it, right? But it was an accidental side effect
Hmm.
of this one piece of technology. A lot of that thinking has gone away. It went out of favor in academia right around the time that we were having a lot of these digital revolutions.
Hmm.
And so this way of thinking went out of favor in the 90s. Other ways of thinking became more popular because of other currents in academia. So you got things like the social construction of technology became much more dominant, which was much more about, I don't really care about what exactly is this technology doing. I just want to use technology as another lens through which to understand social struggle and the way groups compete with other groups for power. And so because of those trends in academia, our big minds stopped thinking as much
Hmm.
about what could happen when technologies come in. That happened to be concurrent with the internet revolution and the smartphone revolution and the email revolution. And so
Hmm.
I think we're kind of caught unaware.
Hmm.
We didn't have the public intellectuals doing that type of thinking nearly as much. And these
Hmm.
changes of the last 20 to 25 years, this tech has had these massive, massive changes. We realize that now. I mean, people used to think I was eccentric back in 2014 for saying,
Hmm.
Be careful about the social media stuff."
Hmm.
It's not just some exuberant innovation that's toppling dictatorships and everyone's, getting around gatekeepers and expressing themselves. Like, there's some issues going on here, and people
Hmm.
thought I was eccentric. And you fast forward 3 years and everyone's on the same page of how do
Right.
we stop these companies. It's like the scourge is the
Yeah.
scourge of our civilization. So we need, this is a more general point, but we need more of this technological deterministic type of thinking.
Right.
You got to be careful about what these tech does. And the best way to be careful about it is to deploy it for very specific reasons so that you can see if this is causing other problems not related to the goal I have. I immediately notice it and can start saying, how do I course correct?
Right. I'm kind of struck also by how academia and our educational system has moved more and more toward kind of micro subjects and um, disconnecting things and going deep on one particular strand without really looking at the whole. So there's really less and less meta analysis, both of future, of history, how things interact. Do you see that, because you're a meta thinker and you're also an academic, do you see that shifting at all, or am I off on that altogether? Is there still a lot of meta thinkers? I haven't seen much of that, and I was in a doctorate program and I wanted to do more of a meta study, and I was kind of discouraged from it, and they said, nah, that's not going to contribute really to the knowledge. We want you to go deep on this one little tiny little area.
I mean, I think specialization is a trend that certainly continues. Yeah, meta thinking is more broadly discouraged. Now, part of it is just there's complexity. I mean, this is definitely true in the scientific fields where I'm
Hmm.
involved. Just the complexity of what we do has grown to the part where it's hard to be a specialist in more than one thing, just because it's so
Right.
hard.
Right.
It's so hard to be a
It's hard
specialist.
to
Like the
get
type of
data.
math
It's
that,
hard to get data at a meta level too. That makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
but even like the math Einstein had to learn to do the theory of relativity is now math that a second year grad student would have already mastered. And the modern quantum mechanics is a much more, takes many more years even just to get to the place where you could do that work. But meta thinking, I think, yeah, is largely discouraged. Um, Public facing engagement with ideas is always a complicated thing in academia. I mean, I walk a complicated tightrope by doing public facing meta thinking on
Hmm.
things like tech and society.
Hmm.
It's not something that's often directly rewarded. It's often seen with suspicion in a lot of universities. Sometimes it's even punished. And then you also have the trend issues in universities where it's very pack like. So certain intellectual schemes will come in and there'll be a lot of pressure to like just everything has to be done through this lens. So it's difficult. It can be in different periods of intellectual history. It can be difficult to say, I want to stand back and have an original take or an original synthesis. It's hard, right?
Hmm.
Because you have people saying that's not what our team is doing right now.
Right.
So that can be difficult as well. And we don't emphasize this with kids. I mean, why aren't we? We should study how to actually concentrate, right? A
Yeah.
big part of the university experience should be comfort with the discomfort of grappling with thoughts.
Yeah. Totally.
We should do that, just like if you're training to play professional sports, you're going to do a lot of wind sprints, right? Because you
Yeah.
got to be in good cardiovascular shape. Well, we got to be in good cognitive shape, but we don't. It's this autonomy mindset. Like it's not. We shouldn't tell people how to do their academic work or this.
Right.
We don't want
Right.
to just you figure it out. We're just going to give you the assignments. I think we should think about that. I think you shouldn't be able to get out of an institution of higher education without having to do some original big thinking.
Yeah.
Like you need to produce like a New Yorker style long form
Hmm.
article that like has a big idea that synthesized some pieces, and we're going to keep running you through the ringer of like this. Let's push back. How do you collect
Hmm.
ideas? How do you
Right.
synthesize? How do you take in opposing ideas? How
Hmm.
do you argue against it? How do you make a good rhetorical case? What's good rhetoric or bad rhetoric? I mean, and
Hmm.
not to go on it, but rhetoric is a whole other thing.
Hmm.
I think the
Hmm.
presence of tools like Twitter
Hmm.
have completely diminished people's understanding of rhetoric. It used to be something
Hmm.
we studied, like how do you actually make arguments? How do you
Hmm.
understand? How do you work forward to get to the
Hmm.
truth? And a lot of that has been replaced with a sort of Twitter fueled sophism, where it's this sort of simplistic dunk culture, which would make Plato cry. Was
They're turning over in
like,
their
wait a
grave.
second,
Right.
wait, you're telling me 2,000 years from now
What?
this is how people are arguing? Wait, I thought I was kicking off a golden age of reason. So I think,
Hilarious.
anyways, it's all to say there's a lot of meta skills, all having to do with thinking,
Hmm.
producing thoughts, engaging with ideas that need to be trained just as much as learning how to do differential calculus.
Totally.
And we don't.
Right. I totally agree. In fact, that's one of the key tenets of our program, Unbeatable Mind, is to teach people how to concentrate, how to understand context and, separate from the context, how how to take multiple perspectives and, to really come to a greater understanding of what's going on. That's really not taught. You're right. It's not taught. More teaching or thinking into how to teach people how to think as opposed to just what to think. Right. It's
And
fascinating.
it's another place where tech has these unexpected impacts. This was another Neil Postman idea in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Just the medium through which you communicate affects the way you think and understand the world.
Right.
And this came out, I mean, he died before social media, but a lot of people believe, and I agree with this, that like the form of social media, like Twitter, for example, it impacts the way you understand the world and think. Like the tools can impact the way you think. If you're mainly communicating through books, you think in a much more lexicographic, long form, discursive way. Postman's argument was the arrival of the printed book changed the way we thought about the world because you could have long discursive discussions and
Hmm.
arguments. And it was this shift in the way we thought, the way our brains actually work, that made the scientific revolution possible, that made the enlightenment possible. You had to
Hmm.
have the tool first. This is his cool big theories. You
Hmm.
had to have the book. And once we were communicating with books, it changed the way we thought about thoughts. And we started thinking in a way that made Galileo possible or made Hume possible.
Hmm.
And so the follow up to that is like, okay, if we're spending a lot of time on Twitter, it's going to change the way we understand the world, the way we think, but probably in this case in a way that's not great. It's going to give us a schema for understanding the world that's very tribal, a very
Right.
simple rhetorical setup where there's
Hmm.
people who are obviously wrong and you're obviously right. And it's a matter of just getting the right angle to do the dunk, and then everyone will applaud you. This stuff matters. The medium actually dictates the way the message itself actually forms in your head.
Wow, that's fascinating. As we wrap up here, I'd love to give, the listeners some practical tips and let's just expand it to just minimalism, digital minimalism, so that we can concentrate and do deep work and this idea of, email processing or setting up email processes being a subset of that. But what are, and maybe approach it from the perspective of how you kind of organize your life for, to get all the amazing things accomplished that you do. What are some, the
Well,
top
one,
tips?
yeah, I mean, one thing I recommend, especially when it comes to this overload issue, is use your actual inbox like right now as it exists to figure out what are the processes I keep executing again and again. And the way to do it is just every email that comes in that you're answering, say, what larger repeated process is this a part of? Oh, this is part of the answering client emails process, I
Hmm.
guess, because I'm getting back to a client. This is about, I'm setting up a meeting here. Okay, this is about my meeting setup process. If you just go through your inbox in a typical day, you can list out, oh, here's all the things that I mainly come back to again and again that make up my job. I really recommend doing that because once you see your job as a collection of these repeated processes, these things you come back to again and again, now you have the option of optimizing. And so do that exercise, have the list, see all the things that make up your normal workday, and then start asking for each. How do I actually implement this? Do I just jump on Slack or just jump on email? What could I do that might have less of these unscheduled messages? What about this one? What's the way to do this to would have less of this unscheduled messages? Switching to that mindset of optimizing processes and away from optimizing how I interact with an inbox.
Hmm.
That makes all the difference. And then once you're in that mindset and you start making some changes, you will see really big changes. The simplest process to optimize in this way is if you have to set up meetings a lot, shift over to a scheduling software like
Hmm.
Schedule Once or Acuity or X.AI. This is a process that most people are involved in that creates a lot of back and forth messages.
Right.
It's a real cognitive weight that we
Agreed.
kind of overlook. And that's a great way to put your toe in the water here. It's a simple process we all do. You throw some of the software at it, you do one message meeting scheduling. Here's all my times, pick what works for you. That gives people a real taste. And then they start thinking, okay, well, what are these other processes where I could do something similar? So that's a good way, I think, to get your feet wet with this whole approach of replacing the hive mind process by process.
Hmm. What has worked for you to get your brain disengaged from, you know, the constantly grasping for email? I mean, what tricks do you use to get dis technologicalized in that regard?
Well, the less demand you have to be in there, the better, right? So if just the number of back and forth conversations needing your attention is greatly reduced, the attraction or pressure
Starts to
to either
release. Yeah.
check that or think about that is greatly reduced. So you
Interesting.
really have to bleed off a lot of this steam.
Mm.
And that's where replacing the processes help. And then once you bled off a lot of this steam, and now your inbox isn't so demanding because it's not so much of this real-time back and forth that you have to be a part of, then you can corral it. And I time block plan. That's my big thing. So I work out a plan for the hours of my day in advance. And here's what I want to do then. Here's what I want to do at this point. Here's what I want to do during this time. And then once you're time block planning, you can say, and this is when I'm going to do email. And then I'll do it again here.
Mm-hmm.
But until you can get to that point where you can really corral, this is the time I work with communication. You have to usually, I mean, not for everyone, but for most people, you're going to have to bleed off a lot of steam
Mm-hmm.
from within that inbox because it's not going to work. If you have 35 ongoing back and forth conversations, as much as you want to say, okay, I'll just check my email once in the morning, good luck.
Right.
Like that pressure, that thing's going to explode. So you got to let off the steam by replacing the underlying processes until you get to a point where once or twice a day is all the engagement you need with your inbox. That should be your goal. And again, I understand for most people, if you just checked your inbox right now twice a day would be a problem. So you have to replace the processes until it's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to really start to hit a sweet spot of productivity.
Yeah. That's cool. I love that. So what's next? Your work kind of, it's like, following threads, one leads to another, leads to another, to another. What's next for you? Like, what has this research led you to that is opening up for you? Your next frontier.
No, I'm not quite. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what I want to do next, but one idea that's emerged out of this that I'm really interested in is overload.
Hmm.
And I've been really looking into this notion. I started scratching this itch when I was working on this book that we have a human instinct for action.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this human instinct. We want to do things. Boredom is a very distasteful, it feels bad. It's a very deep drive to get us to do things. So just like we have a deep drive to eat, like hunger is very important to us. I think we've set up an environment of tasks in our world, not just in work, but outside of work, where we're probably overloading this instinct and it's making us really unhappy. So just like when we respond to our hunger by eating a bunch of junk, we end up worse. And so I've been fascinated recently with trying to understand. We really understand from a paleoanthropological view this action instinct and the context in which it evolved. Is it possible? Like, what would work look like, or education look like, or just your life outside of work look like if you tried to actually tailor the amount of work you do to match that instinct so that you're not
Mm-hmm.
bored, but you don't feel this chronic overload? And would it be drastic? Because I have the suspicion that we put drastically too much on our plate
Mm-hmm.
and we don't realize the degree to which this chronic overload is like a chronic disease. It's playing with this instinct for action and frustrating. It's making us miserable in ways we don't understand. So I'm interested in that right now. So I've been going down that alleyway because I think we do too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the response to that says, oh, we should just do nothing is also misguided. I think there's some sweet spot in here of, okay, if we wanted to have a evolutionarily justified approach to like how much work we should do and what work should look like and how much stuff we should be doing with our family and how many pursuits we should be doing. I think there's a lot of instinct there. I mean, and
Yeah.
a lot of insights to be extracted, but it's a hard question because we don't fully understand that action instinct. So that's the rabbit hole I've been falling down recently.
Yeah, I love that. I'd love to follow up on that. That's been a big drive for me, is to do less things. And I think I can't remember if this came out of your work or essentialism. Do less things better, right? And so
Yeah.
part of that is to carve out a massive amount of time to just be and to think and to plan and to meditate and to train. So I don't do anything before 11 a.m. I know it's be tough for an academic to do that, but I don't take any meetings before 11 a.m. every day, and I'm done by 4. And I have 3 deep work blocks and then, stuff that fits in between. So it forces me to be very, very selective about what I'm going to do every day. And then,
Yeah.
with that selectivity comes either it pushes it off way down, weeks out, in which cases a lot of things that, of course, that I thought were urgent and important aren't so urgent and important anymore, and they go away. Or I find, some way to, for someone else to do it, or I just say no. And I'm still
Yeah.
working
Do
on
less.
saying no. Yeah. Do less.
But see, I think you're onto something, and I don't have all the foundations intellectual for this yet, but we need to name
Right.
this instinct towards action, because it screws us two ways. I think one, in the moment, you take on too much because there's a reward in the moment when you say, yes, I'm going to do this. There's this reward for, yeah, we should be doing action. And so we say yes way too much because in the moment you get the reward for like, oh, I'm doing something, or I like the idea of doing something. So we take on too much.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side of this action instinct, I'm assuming, is that if you don't accomplish something that you set out to do, you feel bad because it's trying to drive us to actually complete things. So then we get screwed on the other end because now we have too much on our plate to really get done well. And that makes us miserable. And so it's just like, well, I'm hungry and I get the reward in the moment for grabbing all the chips and the candy bars. But then down the line, you say, oh man, I feel terrible and
I
I'm
suck
sick.
because I didn't
So,
get things done right. Yeah.
so I think there's something going on.
Well,
Like what
the
you're doing,
flip
like
side
let's
of that,
start at
Cal,
11. Yeah.
is if you're just constantly doing things, you're not taking time to evaluate which are the right things to do, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
the idea of tripping over dollars on the way to the pennies, right? From an idea standpoint. And I find like even to
Just,
this day, things that slip through, like I'm going back and forth today with this stupid journal I've been trying to create, which, I just wasn't getting anything done. So I found out I tried to outsource it, couldn't, it's not getting done. And so now I'm going back and forth on this $5,000 project, which, I shouldn't have been touching. Right. And
yeah.
so I'm like, okay, I should have had a better process for that. Or I should have said no.
Yeah. And I think, you mentioned Greg McHugh, and I think he's really smart on this with essentialism, right? That
Yeah.
we do too much and we should do less. I just think that's an idea we need to keep pushing. We really, I mean, it's such a crucial idea. It's like the very first book that comes out that says we should probably care about what we eat. You're
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, that's right. I think we need to keep looking at this.
Yeah,
I think
I agree.
there's a lot to unpack here. And so there's something going on here with this chronic overload.
Mm-hmm.
It's making us miserable. And there's been a lot of books that make me a little bit concerned that their response to the chronic overload is like, we should do nothing. And
Mm-hmm.
that any drive to want to do something is mainly just like an exploitative relationship with someone who's trying to exploit you, and really humans just want to do
Yeah.
nothing. That's not right
Right.
either.
That's not right. I agree.
We want to do things. It's very, I mean, let's talk to Viktor Frankl about
Mm-hmm.
logotherapy. It's
Right.
kind of important to have things to do, but we've fallen out of sync with our instinct, which is a story that happens again and again throughout the history
Mm-hmm.
of humans, that
Right.
as our context changes away from our ancestral environment, we fall out of sync with our instincts all the time. This is what I think is happening with productivity. We've fallen out
Mm-hmm.
of sync, and we're 6 monitors at the same time, jumping
Mm-hmm.
from this on email and doing all the social media, 19 projects, and building out these teams that are bigger than we need, and jumping
Mm-hmm.
on Zooms, and we're eating a bunch of junk food.
I love it. Fascinating conversation, Cal. Thanks so much for your time, man. I love it. I love to follow your work, and I can't wait to take another look at my inbox and figure out what I can turn into a process. That's going to be my next
I love
project
it.
today. Yeah. So thanks again.
Cool.
Your book, A
Thanks, Mark.
World Without Email, is in the marketplace. Before we go, how else can people find you? Like, what's your favorite platform for interacting with people?
Well, I don't really have any platforms.
Okay.
Um, I
How
do have
about
a website.
podcast? Your podcast.
I do have
Okay.
a podcast. Yeah, yeah. It's one way. I have a podcast called Deep Questions, where I twice a week answer questions for my audience on all this type of stuff, from the big ideas to the how do I get out of this email jam. And my newsletter is at calnewport.com. That's where I write my weekly essays on these topics as well.
Awesome. A world without email, reimagining work in a world of communication overload. Man, I'm going to get that book as soon as I hang up here. I usually like to read these before the podcast, so I apologize I hadn't. But what a really important contribution, Cal. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon. I hope.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
All right, you take care. All right, folks, that's the Unbeatable Mind podcast. Wow, you're going to want to forward this one and listen to it twice, and have your whole team listen to it. Super, super important. A lot of important topics covered here. I recommend you go out and get Cal's book, A World Without Email. And when you're done with that, go get Digital Minimalism and Deep Work. They're all really, really important contributions. Great stuff. Thanks so much for supporting the Unbeatable Mind podcast. Really appreciate it. Don't forget to rate us in iTunes and wherever else you listen to podcasts. And until next time, stay focused and turn your email into a process, and stop crushing yourself with that anxiety. Stay focused, be unbeatable. Hoo-yah. Divine out.